We've got a small but mighty crew here this evening, but we're really thankful that you joined us, and maybe some other people will be popping in as we go. But I'm excited to have Linda Ketcham with us today. Linda is the executive director at Just Dane, and she'll tell us a little bit more about herself. But just so you know, Taking a Faithful Stand, we have a webinar on the second Tuesday of every month at this time from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And this is a joint effort by Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, Micah, Wisconsin Council of Churches, Wisconsin Council of Rabbis, Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice and Wisdom. And again, my name is Matt Kinzer. I'm the executive director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. We will have a time at the end, and we can keep it a little bit more informal with a smaller group like this, but we would ask that you just give Linda time to share her presentation, and unless she asks for questions, and jump in by all means. And then we will leave some time at the end for a question and answer time. If you feel comfortable asking questions in person via Zoom, just raise your hand when that time comes. If that's something that makes you feel anxious or uncomfortable, you're welcome to just type any questions that you have into the chat, and then either Linda or I will make sure that those questions get answered. But without further ado, help me welcome Linda Ketcham tonight.
Thanks, Matt. Hey, everybody. I see Ellen, who I know. Nice to see you, and Gail, so yeah, nice to see you all and to join you this evening. I want to thank you. Yeah, Just Dane has been around for a little over 50 years. We were formerly known as Madison Area Urban Ministry, or MUM, so some of you may know us from that. I know at the last webinar, which I tuned into on the recording, and I saw Mary Kay Baum, who was my predecessor here at Just Dane 20 years ago. So I always see a few friendly and familiar faces when I'm in these spaces, so I really appreciate the invitation. Um, and some of the work that we do at Justine, we work with individuals returning home after incarceration through our Journey Home and Circles of Support programs. We created, under Mary Kay's tenure, the reentry simulations that we do across the state. Other groups have copied them, but there's none better than the one we do. I'll just put that out there. Um, and sometimes they copy our materials without asking. I'll put that out there too. Um, so, so just saying, it's important we have ethics in these spaces. Um, so the reentry simulations, which we've been doing since 1999, we have a peer support reentry program. So folks with their own lived experience in the realm of reentry, but also in recovery from substance use and or other mental health challenges. We have a mentoring program for kids who are impacted by parental incarceration. For many years, we took kids monthly to visit their moms at Tachita, a program called Family Connections. We would love to start that again. It was put on hold during the pandemic, and we've yet to get corrections to consistently respond to our requests to start that program up again, which is frustrating because kids really need to see their moms, and moms really need to see their kids. We have an employment training program called Just Bakery, which also students earn college credits at Madison College and automatic acceptance into Madison College's culinary program if they graduate. Um, we have a medical recuperative shelter for unhoused families who have a member being discharged from the hospital called Healing House. It is the only medical respite in the country that is specifically for families that are unhoused. And have also always served as a fiscal sponsor for grassroots projects and organizations as they work to get their 501(c)(3) status. And then we also do advocacy on issues that impact the folks who walk through our doors, and that includes on budgets and things like fair and affordable housing and justice reform, economic justice. So that's a little bit about what we do. And again, we've been around for quite a while. I can like to say that our work at Just Dane is reflected in the words of Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who said, "Charity, yes, always, but never as a substitute for justice." And so the work that we do encompasses both. Um, so last year, when Doge started to release its list of hit the agencies that they wanted to hit. We started to go through that, trying to figure out how this was going to ripple out. And it became really clear that this administration is targeting essentially everything that helps the people we care about, that hits and harms all of our vulnerable neighbors, the stranger, the poor, the hungry, the imprisoned. And so those ripples are just, we're going to see those ripples and continue to see those ripples. And HR1 was kind of the first, not the first volley, but certainly the most, I think, significant in terms of impacts on some of the regular funding. It really was a change in the partnership between municipalities and the federal government and states. You know, we've had this partnership. There's a thing called the social compact, right? And that we care for one another and about one another. And HR1 just starts to shred that. And part of how it does it is this, as Bill talked about at the last webinar, these massive shifts of costs to the states and to municipal governments. And that's going to ripple out through the communities, and that's going to strain already struggling budgets. You know, I don't know what you're seeing in some other areas of the state, but certainly here in Madison, we are already and have been seeing increases in homelessness, increases in food pantry usage. And as HR1 is starting to be implemented and rolled out, we're seeing those needs grow even further. You know, the National Association of Counties has estimated that HR1 may result in over $1 trillion of increased costs to counties over the next 10 years. So if you can think about what that's going to look like to our state, and particularly to our rural counties as they start to pull that funding away, and those mandated services fall on counties and local governments. It's just this massive cost shift in costs. So the costs don't go away. We're just going to struggle more to pay them. Counties have statutory obligations that require them to adhere to specific mandates, to provide certain services, and to live within certain revenue constraints while they provide those mandated services. Counties throughout the country, throughout Wisconsin, are diverse. According to the National Counties Association, about a third of counties in the country are growing, about a third are stable, and about a third are declining. But these cuts in HR1 and these changes don't recognize that. And so they're going to roll out and they're going to impact counties in all those different economic places. So I like some of I like the list that the National Counties Association gave in terms of some of the things that counties are specifically responsible for in the US. In 29 states, they implement and administer veterans programs, and that includes in DC. The services on over 600 million acres of publicly owned land, over 900 hospitals and 700 long-term care facilities. Counties operate 91% of local jails, and they're the providers of the health services, including mental health services in those facilities. Counties own and maintain 44% of public road miles in the United States, 38% of bridges, 40% of transit agencies, and 34% of airports. Counties and cities administer elections, at least for now, and they manage, fund, and operate 7,050 public safety call centers that handle emergency calls and coordinate emergency responses. So we think about all those services that counties provide, and there are more, but those are some of the ones that are highlighted. And you think about this massive cost shift to the counties for these other services. And how in the world are we going to pay to maintain those services I just listed and pick up the extra cost? And that's the thing we're going to struggle with. And we're already struggling with because revenue hasn't kept pace in many ways with the increased costs and increased need that we see. So in cities and counties and townships in Wisconsin provide hundreds of millions of dollars in safety net services. Some of that's administered directly by the county. Some of it's provided by nonprofits through contracts with the county and private funding matches. And HR 1 impacts all of those. When the federal government cuts funding to mandated services and shifts the cost to the local governments, then local dollars are going to have to be used to fill those gaps and fund the mandated services. The result is that other non-mandated services that get paid with local funds may get cut. For example, for us, I mentioned our peer support program. Our peer support program is funded and it's a collaboration with Centro Hispano here in Madison. And we work collective together to serve both the bilingual bicultural community as well as um, general reentry population. And through Centro, that legal system impact also includes folks caught up in the immigration system. But those are funded through city and county dollars. Those are not federal dollars, obviously, or they wouldn't be funding the Centro portion of it. Um, but it's not mandatory. So what happens to that funding? We don't know when city and counties have to start pulling those non-mandatory dollars from non-mandatory services that are still vital to our community and still vital to the people we serve. What happens? And I'll tell you what happens when we think about peer support work and the work that not just us, but peer support programs around the state are doing. Unmet mental health needs increase. And when unmet mental health needs increase, that often means law enforcement contacts increase. And when law enforcement contacts increase, it means jail time increases. And so these things start to ripple out, whether it's federally funded or not, there's still going to be a cost to the community. And so we have to start thinking about that in the global picture in terms of how all these funds are connected, how they all intersect with each other to create the safety net. And you can't just clip parts of the safety net away and hope that it holds and hope that things and people don't fall through. So when they do that, I mean, we got to raise money somehow, right? But the challenge, especially in Wisconsin, is how to do that because Wisconsin actually has the most restrictive rules in the country related to how municipalities can raise money. So some of the ways municipalities get their money is through shared revenue. Shared revenue is the state's primary local aid program. It redistributes income and sales tax money that the state collects to municipalities across the state. Distributions based on a formula. I'm not going to pretend maybe Matt or Connor, or Gail, you could jump in and explain in great detail and accuracy the formula for shared revenue. But I will say this, it has not kept pace with inflation and that it is not insulated from political influence. So shared revenue was created in 1911. So it's well over 100 years old. It's been tweaked a few times. It was tweaked in the 70s and again in the 80s in terms of the formula. It was tweaked in 2012 under the Walker administration. And under that administration, the formula was shifted a bit and some tiers were created that pushed a larger percentage increase of shared revenue funds to small rural communities that tended to vote red and smaller percentage increases to larger communities that tended to vote blue. Act 12 in 2023 tweaked it again and did the same thing. And in 2023, the formula resulted in average increases of 202% for communities of less than 5,000 people, but just 25% for cities with 50,000 to 110,000 people. Cities larger than 110,000 people saw a 35% increase. So under 5,000 people, you saw a 202% average increase per capita on shared revenue. That medium-sized city, you saw that 25%, and then for Milwaukee, Madison, you saw a 35%. So it fluctuates wildly in terms of how much money. So everybody got an increase. It just the percentage of your increase was wildly different depending on where you lived. So as a result, in under Act 12 in 2020, which passed 23, Towns with populations of 36 to 100 people saw saw an increase of over 5,000% in their shared revenue per capita. By contrast, Milwaukee saw a 10% increase. So again, it's not, and Democrats did the same thing when they tweaked the formula too. So it's just not insulated. It doesn't necessarily depend on which party both parties have played these games, but it points to the problems with the shared revenue formula because it is subject to politics. What it actually looked like in dollars, um, the average per capita for most small communities in Madison was $157 per person. In Milwaukee, it was $416 per person. In Madison, it was $28 per person. Yeah, right, Ellen? I saw that look. So, yeah. So, Waukesha was $34, Janesville 76, and my favorite, the village of Big Falls, Wisconsin, with a population of 58 people, received the largest per capita payment of $1,040 per person. Now, obviously, in dollars, that's not huge amounts, but when you think about percentages and services provided and those kinds of things, you can start to see where shared revenue is not the be all and end all for any municipality by any stretch of the imagination. And again, even with those increases, it still didn't keep up with the inflation rate. So those were about, yeah, it was about 8% increase for most municipalities on average. Yeah. Anyway, property taxes. How many of you have recently voted in a referendum to raise the tax levy? Property taxes are generally the biggest funder of services in municipalities in our state. But by state law, there's a tax levy, and a municipality can't raise taxes beyond the levy without referendum. So there's a little loss of local control and local autonomy when it comes to the ability to raise income tax or property taxes. But I think just the proliferation of referenda around the state already demonstrates that our municipalities, our counties, our cities, our towns, our school districts have all been struggling anyway for years to keep up with funding needs, to keep up with increased expenses, growing demand. So they still struggle. And then when you start to shift federal costs onto local governments, that's just going to further burden and potentially result in more referendum to raise property taxes as governments try to figure out how to maintain services. So when we think about property taxes and we're having these conversations, I think it's, in my opinion, and anybody feel free to argue with me. And also anybody feel free to jump in with other information. I'm not an expert in all of this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just kind of geeky and I like to read stuff. So, when we talk about property taxes, I think it's important to talk with our state elected officials, but our federal officials too, and realize that part of why our property taxes are going up is because tax cuts are being given to the wealthiest in our country. And to fund those, the costs are being shifted onto our property tax rolls. I mean, that's part of what's happening, realistically and honestly. Another stream of revenue that is available to counties in Wisconsin, but not to cities, is sales tax. The exception is Milwaukee. Milwaukee did receive permission to implement a sales tax, largely to help support some of the development and maintenance of the sports stadiums they have in the city. But even that has not been enough to ease budget woes within the city of Milwaukee. But cities cannot implement a sales tax without permission from the legislature. And last year, and for many years, a number of cities have been lobbying the legislature, asking them for the permission to put in a sales tax, and they have not been successful. There was a package of bills introduced last year in the legislature that would have allowed municipalities to impose a local sales tax of up to 5%, subject to a referendum approval, but that bill didn't go anywhere. counties and municipalities can raise fines and fees. Now, we don't want to see fines raised because that's generally implemented on people who are already struggling, people who are legal system impacted. Um, and in fact, in Dane County, I sat on a committee for a year and a half that focused entirely on how do we eliminate fines and fees imposed on families in the juvenile court system, because we realize how regressive they are and how harmful they are. So, but it is an option. You can, and the fees portion of it, what we've seen in Wisconsin over the last 10 years are vehicle registration fees or wheel taxes. Now, the legislature seems upset about this, which I think is interesting since we all pay state vehicle registration fees. And in fact, the state fees have gone up consistently. And for those of us who drive hybrid vehicles, we noticed a few years ago that they doubled our fees because we weren't using enough gas. So, and because part of the tax on gas goes to support the roads, the argument was you need to pay more because you're not buying enough gas money or gas. Anyway, so many municipalities, cities and counties have implemented wheel taxes, and those are being used to help support infrastructure, including those roads that counties and cities are responsible for. Last year, the legislature also introduced legislation that would require municipalities to go to referendum to implement a wheel tax or a vehicle registration fee. And had that been successful, they were including those that were already in existence, which would have been interesting because all of those municipalities that already have it in place that had budgeted for the money would have been in the position of having to go to referendum and not actually having the money that was in their budget. Um, Room taxes, there's some taxes you can implement related to tourism, but there are restrictions that require that the majority of that money be used for tourism. So it doesn't really help your general operating fund. Um, some of that reduced autonomy that municipalities have relates to emergency services and law enforcement. And you cannot, by statute now, you cannot reduce funding for your emergency response and public safety, so law enforcement departments, without risking losing a percentage of your shared revenue. So there's a penalty. So even as a city, let's say, you saw, or a good example, Dane County, where last year with our budget battle, because the county was facing a $31 million deficit, and there was a proposal to pretty significantly cut nonprofit safety net services and through funding, via funding to the nonprofits that administer those contracts. At the same time, the sheriff's department has, for many, many years, had 3 to 4 dozen vacancies in their department that someone gets hired, someone leaves, someone gets hired, someone leaves. Millions, millions of dollars sitting in the sheriff's department budget that just kept getting rolled over year after year after year after year, budgeted for these vacant positions that aren't funded. So there ended up being a budget compromise that didn't technically remove it from the sheriff's budget, but temporarily reallocated it to cover part of the cut to the safety net services that were being proposed. Now, it was a stopgap measure because we'll have the same debate next year when we look at the 2027 budget. But had the county decided to eliminate, say, half of those positions, saying, well, we can't keep them all filled anyway. Why are we holding 38 positions vacant? Let's fund 19 of them and take the money for the other 19 and put it into other areas. There would have been a potential penalty to the county for doing that through a reduction in shared revenue. So within those certain constraints, you don't get to decide where you spend your money. For communities that have a significant amount of federal or state businesses or state buildings. So in Madison, for example, all the state office buildings, the UW hospital and clinics, the UW University of Wisconsin and all of their buildings, the federal courthouse, none of that property is on the property tax rolls. So state does not pay property tax. Federal government does not pay property tax. In Madison, that's a significant amount of property that's not on the property tax rolls. There's what they call payment in lieu of taxes, an agreement that the state enters into with the municipality to pay a certain amount of money to support all of the municipal services that the city is required to provide to those buildings, including EMT, police, water, sewage, garbage, all of that. So the state negotiates this rate. However, in Madison, at least, the state generally has not kept their end of the bargain. And in 2024, the state only paid the city of Madison 38% of what it owed it. So it's another challenge that municipalities, small county and city governments can have when they're looking at how they raise revenue. And it's part of why all these potential cuts that are rippling out of HR1 are really difficult for county and cities to figure out how to increase the funding. So they're going to have to make some decisions that are going to be painful. Do you cut back critical services, which might include public health? And remember that 20% of Wisconsin residents are enrolled in the Medicaid program, and almost half of those are kids. Nutrition programs, 700,000 people in Wisconsin are in the SNAP program. Emergency response programs, rural development, housing programs, mental health, substance abuse. How are we going to fund all of those? Will the county try to continue or the city try to continue services at the new cost? Which is, again, is going to require new revenue or shifting monies around from other departments and other services. Do we raise local taxes or fees? Well, we kind of walked through how easy that is to do in Wisconsin. Delay investments in infrastructure and other projects. We reassess programs that are being offered that aren't mandated and cut those. Do we try to rein in the growth of county government or city governments in some areas? Are there places where things can be cut? Those are all decisions that I think are gonna be, those are all decisions that are facing municipalities. I think certainly one option too is what Bill Hogseth brought forth last time, which is to organize, right? And to organize at every level of government to make sure that we're educating city common council members, county board members, state legislators, state senators, our House of Representative, members of House of Representatives. I know in some counties it's hard for you to find them, but when you can, when they do show up or hold a public hearing, to bring these things forward to them. I remember one of the things that struck me, and I see James Morgan on here too, and James was at those meetings, those county budget meetings too, in Dane County. But I remember as they were debating whether to temporarily reallocate some of those sheriff department funds. And this was a very difficult decision for some of the rural county supervisors who rely, their municipalities and their district rely on the sheriff's department for law enforcement. They don't have their own police departments. They contract with the sheriff's department. So this was very difficult for them. But one of those supervisors stood up and talked about this. She decided in looking at all of the data, she decided what she was going to do was go visit the meal program, the senior meal program in her county, in her district. And she went and realized that this meal program in her district is operated by one half-time staff and a lot of volunteers. Cutting funding for that program of 8 to 16% would have cut the hours of that half-time staff person who supervised and organized the volunteers who were actually taking meals to people. And she realized that those meals that were being taken to the volunteers, those volunteers, for many of the folks that were receiving the meals, that's the only contact they had with another human being all week or all day. And they were performing wellness checks because those were the folks who knew what was going on with the people who were getting the meals and could come back and tell the part-time staff person, hey, this person said that they haven't been feeling well, they've been feeling dizzy. So you could talk about a wellness check, talk about connecting with public health. So it was when she started to really connect with the services being provided, in the community and talking with the folks providing the service that she really realized how detrimental those cuts were going to be. So to the extent that we can also engage local elected officials in really visiting and really paying attention to the services that are being funded and how important they are to the people who receive them. I think that helps us build this case to push back on these federal cuts. Um, uh, I can go on and on, so I'm trying to stick to my notes. So I apologize for James will tell you. James Morgan and I go way back. We work together, and yeah. So um, I think Bill brought up last time that some of those cost shifts, county and federal government have had an equal partnership in funding the administration of SNAP benefits up until HR 1. And now instead of funding 50%, the federal government will fund 25% and push that other 25% onto the county. So where will the county find that extra 25%? There are new federal limits on taxes, provider taxes that the state and local governments can implement, and those are taxes they've used to help finance their share, their part of the Medicaid program. There are new administrative burdens. The new SNAP and Medicaid work requirements, along with SNAP benefit cost sharing, will be tied to payment error rates at the state level with specific benchmarks. So looking at this, the feds are going to look at, oh, did you make error, did you have an error in enrollment or administering this program? Oh, we're going to ding you on this. And I read an article that was talking about right now the state of Wisconsin's error rate is a little above that federal benchmark. But the interesting thing is that it was below that benchmark before the federal government implemented these benchmarks and then gave no guidance to the states on how to implement the changes to the program. So the feds made changes, didn't tell anybody how to adjust the program, and now they're going to ding you for not successfully implementing the program. So again, these are some of the ways I think that this administration is attempting to undermine the safety net in some pretty sneaky ways. There's going to be more people in the system, more workload for folks in the nonprofit sector as well. So HR 1 for SNAP and Medicaid eligibility eliminated exemptions in the work search for some veterans, for kids who are young people aging out of the foster care system, people with certain disabilities, parents who have children age 14 to 17. So more people are going to need to engage in work search activities and be enrolled in those kinds of programs, which will increase the number of people in those programs. And yet, for example, we have a food share employment training contract with Dane County. It's federal money that flows through the state to the county to the provider. We provide half of the money privately for the contract. It's called a 50-50 contract. The federal government provides the other 50%, but the federal government has not, our FSET contract dollar amount has not changed since 2010. So, but we'll see more people coming through the program and we will be serving them. So it will increase caseloads, which then has the potential to increase wait times and effectiveness of some of the programs. They increased the age requirement for people in SNAP for work search. So it used to be 18 to 54 years old, you had work search requirements. It's now 18 to 64 years old. I will tell you, one of the challenges we are seeing in our reentry programs, and we're going to see this as an intersection where there's going to be a huge gap. It's kind of a different, and so it's a different subject, but it relates to in this sense. The average age or the fastest growing age demographic in our prisons and jails nationally are people age 55 and older. We have incarcerated people for so long that the fastest growing age demographic are people heading into their elderly years. And at Just Dane, we are seeing that and have been seeing it. We've been sounding the alarm for housing programs and everything else, but we're seeing people come out of prison at 63 years old. They've served 40 years. They've never had a job. They have significant underlying health conditions. and they're going to have work search requirements to get SNAP benefits. Now, maybe they can find jobs, but it's not going to happen quickly. I will tell you that. But that's again an example of where this demand is going to grow, and these changes will have definite impacts on caseloads. Um, they've changed how often somebody has to be evaluated for eligibility for the criteria for SNAP. And Medicare used to be once a year. Now it's twice a year. So they've just doubled the workload for all of the folks who do the eligibility screening and verifications for those programs. Changes to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. The estimates are the uninsured population in the US will increase by 10 million by the year 2034. Reduction of healthcare coverage is going to strain county health systems. And remember, counties are required to help maintain their health systems. They have to provide indigent care regardless of insurance status. So that's going to additionally burden an already overburdened healthcare system, and the funding for those systems. And I think, again, what we have to get legislators, we have to get beyond kind of what's a liberal, what's a conservative. We all need healthcare. We all need a livable wage. We all need housing. So we have to figure out a way to have these conversations and recognize, for those of us who live in more blue areas, that who's going to be most impacted are going to be our neighbors in rural counties. And we have to move beyond divisions and say, we're going to advocate for you because we see your humanity and we see your inherent worth and dignity. And so we have to, as Bill was saying at your last webinar, have to figure out how to engage beyond that political divide and say we are organizing together so that we all have a high quality of life, regardless of where we live. So, and I lose track of time, so I'm going to check here real quickly. All right. So, the 2026 budget passed a couple weeks ago. It didn't include some of the original cuts that were proposed by the president in areas of community development block grants and other programs, but we anticipate they'll keep pushing for cuts in subsequent budgets. We had an example so right now, the continuum of care, which is HUD money that funds an array of services, including shelter and permanent supportive housing and transitional housing and street outreach and all of those things. Those are 2-year funding cycles. The Trump administration tried in November to circumvent that 2-year cycle, and they issued a notice of funding opportunity a year early. And what we saw in that, we call it a NOFO. What we saw in that NOFO were some changes that that didn't just relate to the total amount of dollars, but there were some really weird shifts in how they wanted to spend the money. And this is going to be a challenge to us too at the county level and city level. So they wanted to significantly shift how much money would be spent in permanent supportive housing. And so housing where this is your home, you are living here, and then there's supportive services to help you maintain that housing. So people who have mental health challenges, people in recovery from addiction, they have those supports where they stay in permanent housing. They wanted to shift the bulk of money out of that and put it into transitional housing, which is by definition temporary. So we want to take money away from permanent housing, which would kick people who are in permanent housing out of their housing, and increase funding to transitional housing. And to receive those transitional housing funds, you would have to provide a significant amount of services on site, basically like 40 hours a week of services, but there's no funding allocated for the services. So it had this whole bizarre shift of where they wanted to put the money. The other thing that was in there and how they were going to score it was that to score high on the application, you had to be a community that did not have, you had to agree to participate with law enforcement when they cleared out encampments of people who are unhoused. You could not have ordinances that supported public camping or the ability of people to sleep in their cars, those kinds of things. You had to, there were a couple of other things that were just these policy statements that you would have to agree to that I think for a lot of communities will cause a real moral crisis if we were to agree to adhere to those to get the money. And if you don't agree to them, then your application will be scored likely so low that you would not receive funding. So it's not just about where they're putting the money or it's not just about how much money, it's where they're putting it, but it's also the rules that they want to put in place in terms of what you have to do as an agency and as a provider and as a professional to get that money. And I think for us at Just Dane, what that boils down to is the question of, and I think it does for a lot of people, are you willing to sell your soul to get the money to provide the service, except that the service is not going to be the service that you really want to provide, and it's not going to be the service that you know, based on evidence-based practices, is most effective, and on and on and on. So this is part of the dilemma I think that our communities are facing as well as they look at these funding opportunities that come out, and what are we willing to agree to get the money. And one other one was that you would verify immigration status among all your program participants. So, and that's not an exhaustive list, but it's just an example of how some of this stuff is going to impact and is already impacting. Now, we were lucky because we were the in the state of Wisconsin, we were part of a lawsuit saying, wait, we were funded for 2 years. Now you're saying it's only a year, but Congress allocated the money for 2 years. So they had to rescind the NOFO, and it gave us an inkling into what they're thinking. So at least we have, 10 months to think about what are we going to have to put together to try to get this funding for these programs. And then what's happening with Department of Homeland Security and that piece of the budget that didn't pass, but that's FEMA, right? FEMA's in there too. And so we're heading into tornado season. And if we can't get FEMA, I mean, there's a national effort not to use FEMA as a bargaining chip, to say that we should pause additional funding for ICE and CPB until their measures of accountability, but we should also pass a standalone disaster specific supplemental spending bill to deal with emergencies and crises. And then also there was a bipartisan bill called Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, or FEMA, cleverly, that would reestablish FEMA as an independent agency outside of DHS and make reforms to the disaster response and recovery system. So FEMA still hasn't responded. DHS with FEMA under it still hasn't responded to the LA wildfires and other disasters from 2025. And we're getting ready to head into seasons in 2026 with that need. So there's some advocacy needed there. In terms of, I think the advocacy that we do together, it's not just the federal advocacy. As you can see, there are constraints that the state legislature has put in place on local municipalities in terms of how we can try to meet the needs for spending in our communities. So I think there's some advocacy that can be done with state legislators related to sales tax for cities being able to implement that, in terms of potentially changing how tax levy caps are set. It's advocacy at every level, basically. And I think, again, we're going to be facing some pretty difficult decisions if we can't figure out how to really effectively advocate on HR1 and the 2027 budget as those come out. And so with that, I'm going to stop because I could sort of go on longer, but I won't. So It is welcome a conversation too, what you all are seeing in your counties, because we aren't all in the same place in the state. So just interested what other people are seeing in your communities too, and where the struggles are. Because I know here we have a, see, I said I was going to stop talking. One more thing. Um, One of the examples, so in Dane County in Madison, we're building a new men's shelter, purpose-built men's shelter. It's been needed for a long time. And the planning has been underway for a long time, and the planning and the plans, everything when it came together and and the budgets were allocated for it. At that time, the average highs for the shelter usage were about 200 people, 200 men a night. So all the plans on the purpose-built shelter that's being built right now in Madison and will be finished later this year is designed to hold up to 250 men. Here's the problem. Over the last year, the average number of men in the men's shelter has regularly exceeded 250, and in the last 6 to 8 months has consistently been over 300 people. So the purpose-built shelter will already be at capacity the day it opens, and we will have a need for overflow shelters for the additional potentially 150, because 2 weeks ago, Porch Light had almost 400 men at the men's shelter. So now the city and county are scrambling to find extra money to operate overflow shelters. So when we have what we call extreme weather nights, nights that are the temperatures are below a certain temperature with the wind chill, or above a certain temperature in the summer, or when there are tornado warnings and those kinds of things, those overflow shelters open up and people can get in there. So it's actually a step backward, because we used to have a cap on how many shelter nights you could have in Dane County. So you would get 60, actually men's shelter was 90 nights a year in the shelter. And with the temporary shelter we've had, which has been much larger, there's been no cap. But now we're gonna have to go back to a cap when the new shelter opens. So that's what we've seen. We're building this beautiful new space, and it'll be size-wise obsolete by the time we open it. Um, so what on that happy note, what are all of you seeing? I know we've seen stuff that's rolling downhill in terms of criminal justice stuff. That's always, um, it's part of that aging senior services, right? Is going to be for elderly reentry population is going to be a challenge, and those aren't going to be mandated services at a city or county level. Federal government isn't going to mandate those services. So,
But heard this morning at so there's positives and negatives. Churches United in Care, which is a group that formed out of a summit, faith-based summit, a couple of years ago. They have assisted Pillars, which is our local Appleton homeless shelter. They operate two of the homeless shelters. They had over their Churches United in Care, one of the groups from the Catholic Church, one of the Catholic churches, is assisting with our homeless situation, and they housed between Pillars and St. Joe's, the new housing group, Catholic group, over 100 people a night for those 15 nights. Not every night, but they housed, the high was 100 people for those 15 nights when it was below 10 degrees. So, there's groups that are banding together, faith-based groups, really stepping up. Now, if life was good, we wouldn't have to be here, but we know life isn't good. So I guess, if you try to see a bright light in an otherwise really dark night, these faith-based groups are really doing an awesome job. They're feeding people 2 meals a day, housing them, and at hotels. and it's really expensive, but they're doing it. So
St. Joe's just got or raised $75,000 to help with their program.
That's great. Yeah, Connor.
Yeah, the question I have for you, Linda, is uh, so every year Milwaukee County and Milwaukee City have a structural deficit even before they start to put their new budget together. And that's all to do with the dollars that go up to Madison and the dollars that go up to Washington, D.C. Fewer and fewer of those dollars are coming back every year. My question for you is, there's a disconnect. People get angry locally because they perceive that the city and the county is failing them. But in truth, it's the state and the feds that are putting the city and the county into such difficult positions. And I wonder if you have any guidance for us of how to square that circle to overcome that awareness gap that exists.
Yeah, I mean that is a tough one because you're right. It's when you listen to, anytime almost anytime there's a referendum, people are upset with local government not understanding that these structural deficits are in part related to the reduced funding that's coming back into communities. Yeah, we send off our tax money. I pay my income tax. It goes to the state. It goes to Washington. But yeah, that's those shared revenue dollars are coming back less. And one of the things that I will say I think Madison did and did well when it was going to referendum 2 years ago. And there was advocacy council, Wisconsin Council of Churches, Wisconsin Faith Voices, a number of our Just Dane banded together and offered testimony as well at budget hearings. But I think one of the things the city did well, so that's one of it. I think when we can get faith-based communities to get the word out and do education within our congregations about that disconnect, that it's that can help. One of the things the city does, maybe the city in Madison did, and maybe Milwaukee did too, but they actually did a series and they did it. I'm trying to remember exactly how many. They had a three-part budget series, and they went to different parts of the city and did these presentations on the different parts of the budget. But part of it also talked about the structural deficit and how did we get to where we are? What makes up that structural deficit? That's where people really started to understand kind of that shared revenue, because I remember somebody asking if Madison had received, say, the same kind of the average, the state average, what would our structural deficit be? And the response was, in looking at the numbers, it would have brought that down from like 28 million to 7 million. And 7 million was actually doable through reduced spending at the city level. So, so I think if in Milwaukee's a much bigger city, obviously, so it'd be a lot more complicated to do that. But certainly, I think if people were willing to reach out to Madison and they used oh, I'm blanking on the think tank that helped them put it together, but put some of the, and I think that also helped with credibility that this was not all of the information on the structural deficit was coming from the city. So it didn't mean that there wasn't some pushback, but the referendum was passed easily, and it was a pretty significant referendum. Again, but referendums don't solve long term. That helped now, but those structural deficits will continue to kind of be an issue moving forward. So, but that was one of the things that Madison did, and I think it's one of the things that, in terms of faith communities combine joining to do advocacy within congregations, but also within the city. I mean, I think it gets media's attention when clergy show up in collar at a common council meeting to testify in support of a tax increase. It's it's just a visual image that draws, but then you can start a conversation. Um, we used to joke in Dane County in Human Services, we often used to have the previous director of Human Services, or two or three directors ago, would often stand up as they were proposing cutting funding to Human Services and say, well, maybe the churches will have to do more. And I always wanted to ask her what congregation she was a member of, and did she tithe? And we didn't go there. What we did end up doing was going to to the county executive at that time and to a few county board members and asking if that was indeed the solution they were suggesting. It seemed to us that what they were actually recommending was a religious tax. And so I think messaging matters. And I will be honest, I've never heard a human services director again say that churches have to do more. So I think, part of it is how we frame the message. And if you're only going to ask certain groups in the community to fill these gaps, it is in essence saying we're taxing certain groups in our community and not others. So what's yeah, but I do think at least in Madison, those were very effective budget sessions. And because they made it, and they got some foundations that donated meals, so they had childcare available, they had a meal available, and there was dialogue. That was nice too, because they actually pulled us into activities at the table of going, okay, so here are the mandated services, here are services that we fund that aren't mandated. Where are your priorities on these non-mandated services? What would you be willing to have cut? Would you be willing to go and have trash collection every other week instead of every week? Would you be willing to, and asking people to really think through kind of what they value that the municipality did and what they were willing to see reduced if they had to do that. And so it did get people in conversation. It did get people talking about why they had what priorities they had. That I thought was so interesting. That you actually could learn from neighbors why this was important to them versus this, and you can have a dialogue. So, but I thought they were very helpful in terms of helping people understand what that structural deficit was. Because I think you can do that even if you're not going to referendum. It's a good way of helping people understand. Um,
Well, thank you so much, Linda. I want to respect everyone's time, and it's now 7:30. I'm sure you can reach out to Linda anytime if you have further questions regarding any of this. Next month, we have Reverend Mark Richards, and he's actually going to be talking about the upcoming Supreme Court election in April. So you won't want to miss that, and that will be on March 10th at 6:30, and we'll put out information about registering for that as well. But as we close, Connor, do you mind closing us in prayer?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Um, Almighty, thank you for the gift of life today. Thank you, Lord, for opening our hearts and our minds to what is true, what is just, what honors you, what honors our neighbor, what honors this beautiful home that you blessed us with, Lord. Um, Lord, would you please bless us with um, greater passion for pushing back against these injustices of the neglect of the people that Just Dane and the rest of us care about, the poor, the imprisoned, the homeless, those on the margins, um, strangers in our midst. Um, Show us the way, Lord, to love justice, to act with mercy, and to walk humbly with you. We thank you, God, for Just Dane and the blessing they are to our community, to our state. We pray for your blessing to be over them. and show us the way, Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and Linda, for your 20 years of service in this way to our community. As a former prison chaplain, the work you do means the world. So thank you all for joining us. You will receive an email with the recording of this in the near future, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great evening.